Hello and welcome back to All Therapists Are Jerks with Yuland
and Joe.
Today on this episode, Joe and I had made a somewhat shared decision to maybe go back and do the biosocial theory together. Generally, I tend to talk about it, and I know that we did a recording. It's one of the first recordings we actually had on the site, and I think it's a bit dry, and we get used to using microphones, so it was probably going to be much more fun to do it with Joe, as we have been doing most of our episodes together.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun to do it together too. Like you said, this is kind of, what you present a lot of times to the parents in our program. When I learned the biosocial theory, I basically learned it in being able to give it in like a 90-second commercial type of way of doing it. So I'm able to give like the nuts and bolts of the biosocial theory. But I think the way that you break it down is extremely helpful. And then how you kind of go back in and talk about how we apply skills then, I think is extremely helpful. So I'm along for the ride on this one. We haven't really co-presented this one together.
So the biosocial theory is a transactional theory. So the idea is that individuals interact with their environment and their environment interacts with individuals. So an individual could take action that will affect the environment. The environment may also respond and put pressure on the individual. So this idea is both, to me, occurring in real time in the moment within relationships, but also it can be a pattern that's happening over a lifetime. So depending on how individuals repetitively interact with their environment can lead to certain learned patterns of behavior, which we've discussed in previous episodes, such as secondary targets and the shame narrative.
Right. And the other thing that is really important about the biosocial theory is it actually fits really well with the dialectical philosophy of the fact that we're all interconnected. So nothing can actually change with an individual without it also impacting the environment, and things in the environment cannot change without it impacting the individual.
Right.
So it fits perfectly with dialectical philosophy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, the biosocial theory in practice, it starts off in what I call a cognitive behavioral therapy cycle, or engine, so to speak. So the idea would be that events happen in life, and these events can be things that could even actually be like a memory or an image in your mind that no one else would know about, but then cues you into an emotional response. When events happen in life, other than like being like totally startled or threatened, most events that we experience get processed through thoughts or like our cognitive filters. So I often refer to those as like lowercase b beliefs. So I often think of your mind's way of viewing the world based on your lived experience to that point. Mm-hmm. So examples might be that you believe that you can trust people till they screw you over. Or maybe it's that, you have to earn my trust before you have it. The world is safe, the world is unsafe. The world is safe everywhere except for like 2 streets in Manhattan and LA,
Mm-hmm.
But these are often things we might not think to ourselves, but they are things that kind of explain why we end up having the emotional experiences that we do have. So an event happens, then we process it through our lived experience to that point, and then we have an emotional response. So Joe and I have some things in common, in our life, but a lot of things are not very common, like her being, a woman, me being a man, us growing up in different states, different family structures. So we have, very different experiences of life up until this point in time. So if an event happens for each of us watching the same event, her and I might have quite different emotional reactions, or maybe not, but that would depend upon how that event is filtered through our own lived experience to that point.
Well, and our own thought process about those lived experiences as well. We talk a lot about in DBT about perceptions and how different perceptions can both be valid at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And so the idea, in an ideal world in the cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea would be within this engine that when I have an emotional response, that I can actually accept how I feel in that moment and also feel how I feel, and that I can actually tolerate it or modulate that affect. And so if I can experience the emotion and to be effective at the same time, then I could go back and look at maybe changing the event for the next time it comes around, or changing behaviors. Maybe I could change the way I think about things or perceive things, or maybe decrease my judgment. So there are a lot of things I could do in response to an emotional response I had from an event. However, that is clearly the result of me being able to actually modulate my emotion. So that what that means is I can experience my emotion and I can be effective at the same time. One way I view effectiveness is that effectiveness is actually making decisions for your long-term self-interest or interest of others. So that would be the short game versus the long game. Mm-hmm. So often what happens is, a lot of times you think about like making a decision in the moment, like we talk about a positive decision, so to speak, like, oh, I could have this candy bar, or I'm watching my weight, The candy bar is delicious, but, if I eat too many of them, I gain weight, so you get to think about it in a health way. But there's also, to me, more importantly, is actually there are many times in life where we feel tension in the body or discomfort. And then what we're doing is we're making a decision for relief. And I think this is pretty common and very difficult to experience. So that'd be the idea. If I'm really emotionally upset, do I want to avoid my emotions or make a decision to help me avoid the emotions, which in the short term I feel less tense, which is why I would want to do it. Mm-hmm. But often those decisions do not play well for my future.
Right. And I think an example that you've given in the past is like if I show up to work and my boss is really short with me, that is an event that happens. I might have some thoughts about that, about, wow, like my boss woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning.
Right.
And then I can have an emotion of like maybe a little bit of fear or anxiety around that person. I want to not maybe, expose myself to that person or be around that person very often. And if we can regulate emotion, that's fantastic. We can like thought challenge a little bit and say, well, maybe he had a bad day at home. Maybe he's got some other vulnerability factors or stress on board that I'm not really aware of. And then I can make a choice to not engage with him or, be able to ask him like, hey, is there something going on that like I need to be aware of or that I can change? Or I can choose not to pick that battle that day. If I can't regulate my emotion, then I could become completely dysregulated at work. If I use behavioral dysregulation as a way to regulate my emotion, I might engage in behaviors like maybe lashing back out at my boss or being passive aggressive toward him. The whole concept of being in that CBT kind of triangle of being able to regulate like emotions and thoughts and behaviors is all based on skill and the ability to modulate emotion.
Right. So I can meet the demands of my environment if I can regulate my emotion. Also, to regulate emotion, what also is necessary, and this can tend to get, I think, forgotten, is the idea that we need validation to be able to regulate emotion. So validation could come from one or two sources. It could either come from myself, like I know how to validate my own emotional experience, or that I have validation from the environment. A lot of residents and patients we work with actually aren't very good at self-validation. Actually, they're highly invalidating of themselves because of the shame they experience. So then they become dependent upon environments to validate them. Yet at the same time, they also almost always come from environments that are a lot more invalidating maybe than average, or at least definitely more invalidating to them than what works for them, if that makes sense. So they often need environments that are far more validating, and they often don't have those needs met by the environments they come from. When we think about emotion dysregulation, so what goes wrong when we can't regulate emotion? So in general, emotion dysregulation is a bit about like avoidance of emotion. So it's a failure to experience emotions fully. Sometimes we do things to avoid, like having safety behaviors. Like I'll talk about social anxiety and how if I, go to a party, I will never go without my friend going with. But that's not really necessarily helping my social anxiety so much. The ideal would be, if I go to a party and don't hang out in the corner by myself, but actually have to try to talk with everyone and try to play like I'm an extrovert, like anyone else would be who's extroverted. So I can't engage in a bunch of avoidance and safety behaviors. Otherwise, I never quite acclimate or habituate to that anxiety. Difficulties that start arising from avoidance of emotion and dysregulation is that we begin to develop less ability to problem solve when emotions are justified. So basically, emotions are kind of a shorthand way of realizing that something's not quite right or something's off. And if we're aware of our emotions, then we know there's something that needs to be done. So if I know what my primary emotion is, which would be the emotion that most likely I feel first, but also makes the most sense for that event, then I would know that emotion, then I would know what problems need to be solved. But if I'm highly avoidant of emotion, I don't know what problems to solve, and I might create problems or solve problems that are really actually not the core problem with what I need to solve. We also can learn that maladaptive patterns tend to work to lower physiological intensity. So maladaptive patterns could be like self-injury might be something that we would do to avoid emotions or regulate our emotions, or it might get into substance abuse or other behaviors that in the moment reduce the tension that we feel. However, over time, we're getting more and more sensitive to emotion because of the avoidance. So one of the things that's pretty clear about the emotional circuits or the emotions humans experience is the more we avoid an emotion, actually the more sensitive to that emotion we become less tolerant of it over time. So this avoidance starts making us kind of hypersensitive to emotion. So we become more emotionally reactive.
And to be clear, the thing that we are trying to avoid is the physiological response to the emotion. So we have that increased heart rate and that discomfort in the body, sometimes shortness of breath, and we can't tolerate how it feels in the body, which is why we then would move into the avoidant behavior.
Mm-hmm. And the benefit to emotion regulation, so the better we are able to regulate emotion and the more we do it, the better we get at it. So much like emotion dysregulation breeds more emotion dysregulation, the more success we have with regulating emotion leads to more ability to continue to regulate emotion. So Marsha Linehan was quite interested in working with people similar to herself, I believe, that actually had a very difficult time with experiencing emotions as they were and often would have a loud experience of emotions, and then they couldn't remain effectiveness and do what was needed in the environment. So they would get kicked out of the cognitive behavioral therapy cycle and they would end up in emotion dysregulation. And we talk about the dysregulations, a lot of that has just kind of generically to do with a pattern of avoidance. So they would become emotionally dysregulated. So the reason that we get kicked out from being regulated to dysregulated, part of it has to do with an increased heart rate. So we become physiologically intense. So whatever the physical sensations Joe was talking about earlier, the physical sensations you might be feeling in your body, you also start feeling this sense of threat or a sense of kind of like excitement or anxiety or arousal on top of that emotion. So it becomes uncomfortable. And when we start dysregulating, it's not possible to accurately express emotion. So generally speaking, we start becoming highly inaccurate with how we express emotion to our surroundings. So there are really three ways to see inaccurate emotional expression. One is an overexpression of emotion. So panic attack might be something where you initially have some anxiety and that might, fit the facts. However, to have a panic attack never really, fits the facts as far as like the extent or the level or intensity of emotion is something that's really never going to be adaptive, but yet you can have a panic attack and they're quite miserable to experience. I wouldn't, wish that on, my worst enemy. But again, that's an emotional response that's just too loud. Punching a hole in the wall is generally too loud of an emotional response as well for anger.
The other way that emotion dysregulation can come across too is not to express any emotion at all. Mm-hmm. So we can start to stuff or suppress our emotions, or we'll experience the emotion internally, but externally we're really not showing any signs of that emotion. Mm-hmm. And that can happen when we get flooded. Right. If we just try to we kind of tune it out or shut everything down. So dissociation can be a form of behavioral dysregulation too. Right.
And more of a, as dysregulation occurring, it's hard to tell because some people don't express any emotion. And if you recall back to talking about the secondary targets, something like somebody being in apparent competence is that they often aren't expressing much emotion outwardly. Internally, they're usually highly anxious, waiting for the other shoe to drop. They don't feel good. They feel incompetent. But on the surface, they present this presentation of everything's fine, I'm normal, everything's okay. Mm-hmm. And that's not really helpful. And they're also can be aware they're suffering in the body, but not really maybe knowing how they feel actually, because things might be pretty jumbled internally. Mm-hmm. A third way that we can be inaccurate in expression of emotion is something called incongruence. And incongruence is where we're often expressing to our environment an emotion that's not really our primary emotion. It could be a secondary or tertiary emotion. And this really, isn't helpful. One is because if we're more focused on a secondary or tertiary emotion, we're never really habituating to the first emotion or having that go through us. And the secondary and tertiary emotion could cause problems or might not cause problems, but the problems we think are going on are not accurate because we're not really with the primary emotion, which is really telling us what's actually going on. So we may be solving problems that don't need to be solved, or we may be creating problems in addition to the ones that need to be solved, but we're never getting back to the primary emotion. So that's that part of that having difficulty with problem solving when it has to deal with emotions. Incongruence is something, and any one of these, we can talk about these, but I would say that sometimes overexpression emotion is wonderful. If it's like love, might be a way to have fun with that. You could not express emotion, and sometimes you have to be in situations where you don't express emotion, and that would be adaptive. And there are times where incongruence is just fun. You can think of humor, and there's cynicism or gallows humor, or having a good time, and humor is often incongruent, and humor is a mature defense mechanism. The difficulty is when you're doing that without your awareness, or that you're doing it all the time. Mm-hmm. So if I'm incongruent all the time, everyone will believe that I don't take their emotions seriously. I won't feel like a safe person to talk with if I don't know when I need to be congruent and to be serious. Right.
And you see that a lot on our unit, especially on weekends. The incongruence will really go up. So because everybody's avoiding loneliness, mm-hmm. So it's a very lonely place to be, especially on weekends. If most of the girls' families are coming and they're going out on passes, the people who are left behind often feel very sad and lonely. And to compensate for that, or they don't want to express that or feel that, then they will overexpress joy. Right. So there'll be times you'll come onto the unit and the energy level is through the roof and people are laughing and joking and you're like, something's going to get dangerous. That's usually what ends up happening.
Right. If, any glance at like past psychiatric histories of, the average resident on our unit, over 90% of them had a previous suicide attempt. Over 2/3 of them had more than 2 suicide attempts. So you start looking at like their lived experience at that point this is not like summer camp for your average teenager. I mean, I feel like the girls are normal in that sense. So I really enjoy them and like them, that they're creative and intelligent individuals, and their emotional experience in the world is not the normal teen experience.
Oh, I was just going to say, so what ends up happening a lot of the times, and we very intentionally in our program have a kind of evening wrap-up section of our night. Mm-hmm. So they have free time where they can maybe play games together, watch a movie, do normal teen type of things. But usually the energy levels start to go up. So we do an evening wrap-up at the end of the night. And the intention of the evening wrap-up is to try to get the congruence level back up, because they're so over-connected in those moments that when they go to their rooms alone, that's usually when the distress really hits and things start to get dangerous.
Right. And another, sometimes it's helpful to talk about incongruent emotions in a way that I'll sometimes make reference to genders. And it doesn't mean that, every woman does this or every man does it this way, but it's more about if you identify with the pattern or not. And so often if you think of, and we'll start with sadness. So I think that's an important emotion, because I think, humans, I think we are all somewhat sensitive to rejection and being alone. And that for individuals who have emotional activities, they have this fear of abandonment because that's been primed so much during their life. So if we start off with like someone who identifies as more of a male in emotional processing, is you might start off with the primary emotion of sadness, but often, we're not really reinforced for expressing sadness or really even aware that we're sad. So men might get into like the secondary emotion of feeling shame. So an example might be, spouse says, hey, your child, was lonely because you've been working so much lately, that they express some loneliness. And so for a husband, it might be like immediately into like, oh God, like I got to get done at work. I'm not working fast enough. Like I got all these projects going on, but I can't get my work done fast enough to get home, or like I feel disconnected. I'm not good enough. So often, that would be the secondary emotion, the sadness of, hey, you've lost connection with your family, but then it goes into it's all my fault that I lost connection. But men don't like feeling small and inadequate, and males are often reinforced for being competent, like being good at what they do. So that just feels miserable. So males are often shift into anger, right? So the problem with that is then, angry at your spouse for like, oh, why would you tell me that? Why would you tell me that, our kids are like sad because I'm never home because I have to work so hard, and that you're going to tell me something like that? Like, so then we get in this fight with our spouse, which is completely off the mark, because initially it's just like, do you recognize how much you're working that we're feeling lonely, you're not home, which I would want to recognize that, you would hope, and then try to connect more to figure that sadness out. But if I shift into I'm to blame for being so busy, and then I don't like that, so shift into anger, none of that's helpful. Right. I mean, to sit there and feel like I'm angry because I don't want to feel inadequate, and I feel inadequate because I don't want to feel sad. And if I just was willing to feel the sadness and express the sadness in the moment, that would be the most effective thing I could do.
And that would actually lead you to be able to problem solve. Right. But now you're having to problem solve the fight that you caused with your spouse. Right. In addition to the fact that, you're working a lot and your kids are lonely for you. So now you have more problems to solve. So you've actually increased your own suffering. Right, exactly. Or maybe I just need to, maybe if I called home for 15 minutes, I'm going to be late, or maybe just do small changes, which really might help my kids feel more connected, because that's really what it's about. The other, and if you identify more in a feminine pattern, would be that, loss of connection, like I said before, would be the primary. And, things aren't fully fair in the world yet. And even though we're working on it, there's still these, almost like interpersonal unfairnesses that still occur for women, that women do to women and men do to women as well. And so there may be the loss of connection that you also could have justifiable anger over too, which might be some unfairness within a relationship, or someone hurts your emotions or does something mean. So you could feel both. However, like in society, when do you ever see like women expressing anger being reinforced as a good thing? Not very often.
No. Yeah. So, well, unless I guess you're like
unless you're like watching wrestling.
WWF. Like, that's
or you're
crazy.
Watching like Real Housewives. You're watching Real Housewives, those ladies get paid to be dysregulated.
Oh, I know they get paid for that, but then at some parties, like, I need to take a shower when you watch it. Like, that still doesn't feel good. It's like, oh my God.
It's like watching a train wreck and you know what's going to happen.
You judge women. Oh my God, she do that totally. Right. Oh my God. So it's not really, boys hit boys. It's like, whatever, they'll figure out their boys are boys. But girls do. It's like, oh my God, she did what? She hit somebody? So it's not really reinforced by any means. And if you're too assertive with your anger too, then you're kind of a B, or bossy when you're a little girl. So you're kind of like,
I was gonna say B's for bossy. No, bitchy. Yeah.
Well, hey, easy in the language. I don't swear.
Colorful language not accepted.
Yes. So that idea, yes, there you go. See, you're a lady. You can't have a trucker's mouth. See how that works? I'm so sexist. I didn't even see it coming. Just, oh, God.
You walked right into it, man.
Walked right into it. It's horrible. I need to, hold on, give me 5 seconds before I make any statement. I'm going to think things through from now on.
Too late.
Too unlike me. So the idea would be, too, that it doesn't feel okay to be angry, too. And also anger feels very powerful and big in the body, and that's a pretty uncomfortable sensation. Not so much for men, I think, but sometimes for women that feels uncomfortable. Also, women are more sensitive to rejection and disconnection in relationships. So a rupture in relationships has been proven to actually be more physically painful for women than for men. So men get rejected. We often, on average, don't take it as hard as the average woman. So you think about how anger, then how painful that feels because they're also more aware of the rejection they feel is uncomfortable. So what happens is women might flip into shame. So I'm a bad mother, bad daughter for being angry. I shouldn't be angry about this. Why am I so angry? It's not okay to be angry about these things. It might have been unfair. And what kind of person am I if I get angry at someone or want to hurt somebody or have that image of hurting someone? It's really, difficult. That shame. Yeah.
So to use your exact same example, so if I come home from work and my spouse says to me, you really should be home more often, your kids really miss you, I can experience the sadness of that, take accountability and work toward changes. Most likely I'm going to snip back at him because I know myself. So I will avoid the sadness and I will express anger and irritation. Like I'm doing the best that I can. I'm spread really thin. I start getting defensive. But then after I'm done being defensive, then I feel like a bitch. I shouldn't have gotten mad at him. It's not his fault. I'm the one who's failing at being a good mom. I'm the one who's failing at work. And then it turns into I'm failing in every aspect of my life.
Right.
When really, if I could just allow myself to experience the sadness of it, I could then problem solve the sadness and move into a change strategy. But that secondary and tertiary expression of emotion, or an emotion that leads to another emotion, and then the thoughts that are around that, it gets really complicated really fast. And it might feel for a person, especially someone with emotional sensitivity, it might feel as though you're getting hit with all of those emotions at the exact same time. So it can just feel like a flurry. Now, that is not how emotions work, but you can have that experience of you're vacillating so quickly between emotions that you can kind of pop back and forth.
Right.
And it gets very confusing, I think.
So I think often how, we think of the identified, what I call the male pattern or the female pattern, so to speak. Really, you're starting off with sadness for both of them, which just totally makes sense. What's more fearful, honestly, than disconnection. But then there's a shame anger thing, and whichever one you do first doesn't really matter. They're basically two sides of the same coin, and that's not really a coin you want to pick up. Anger causes problems in relationships if it's not valid. Also, shame just doesn't really get you anywhere. You just get stuck. So the idea of if a man's got a problem with anger, I would say he has deep-rooted feelings of inadequacy and likely has disconnection in relationships. It's kind of you can take a guess because people are angry all the time or feeling shame all the time. It's not real. They're avoiding some other emotion that makes more sense to their lived experience, but they have a narrative, and we talk about the shame narrative that they've been telling themselves based on their lived experience, which is why someone might experience an extraordinary amount of shame getting feedback where I might be guilty, I did something wrong, or I might just be oh, that's interesting. I didn't know it. I'll try doing it that way. So we will, in the next episode, get into more of what we call the behavioral dysregulation, because this was mostly about emotion dysregulation, and then we'll talk about how certain dangerous behaviors help or actually why. They do help get rid of tension in the moment, but they're not helpful for long term, and we'll be able to review those in the next episode.
So I would say, just to before we end with this one, is as we're getting more and more and more distressed, our heart rate is increasing even more.
Right.
So the more that we're thinking the negative thoughts, the more intense our emotional experiences. So if you listen to the podcast on the 5 dysregulations, you can understand how emotion dysregulation leads to cognitive dysregulation, but cognitive dysregulation can also then reinforce or increase the emotion dysregulation.
Right.
So this is just building and building and building like a snowball.
Right. This has been an episode of All Therapists Are Jerks with Yuland
and Joe.
Thank you for listening.